All right. Okay, CSS with Sass. What's Sass? That's right. All right, so we're going to look at what Sass is and how we can compile it. So Sass is compiled, so you have to use a compiler, but VS Code has a really nice extension that makes this less painful for us. So we'll look at both options. With Sass, we can define variables. You can also in CSS, by the way, but it's a little bit more clunky if you just do it in vanilla CSS. It's quite nice in Sass. We can also nest our styles. We'll talk about what that means. We can define mix-ins, and we can define partials. And all of these things will make our code drier and easier to maintain and easier to understand and easier to read. So that's why I really love Sass. Sass makes CSS reasonable for me. Otherwise, I find CSS completely unreasonable. All right, so there's the repo and everybody's there. So what is Sass? It's syntactically awesome style sheets. That's what it stands for. It's a CSS preprocessor. It gives us the ability to use variables, mixing, and to import multiple CSS style sheets into a single style sheet. You can use plain old CSS in a Sass file too, if you want. So it's nice that way. Really, it's just normal CSS with superpowers. Now, Sass files will have a .scss extension, so you might hear it referred to as SCSS also. So we can use a compiler. You may already have one installed with Ruby. I don't know if I do, only because I've done Rails stuff though, so I'm not sure how I got it on my machine. You can check to see if you have it. Just in terminal right now, run which Sass. Remember, which is a command that will give us the path to an executable if the executable is installed and in our path. You got nothing? Nothing. Okay, so if you got nothing, we can install the Ruby Sass compiler with gem install Sass. You might have to sudo. You have Sass? Yeah. So if you don't have Sass, do a gem install of Sass. If you get a permission error, then just sudo to gem install it. And after you successfully do gem install, if you do which Sass, you should get back a path that's in your Ruby bin directory. It didn't work for you. What did you get? Did you try it with sudo?
Yeah, I have to use sudo.
You won't actually need to use it today, and I'll look at it with you later. Yes? Yeah, looks like you do. So you just have to use the yeah, you'll have to do it with the proxy. We'll just leave it for now. We'll look at it after. We won't actually use this today, but I want you to know that there's 2 ways to do it. Yes? You have the same error that Aiden got, so we'll look at it after. We won't actually use it for this lesson, but we'll have a look at it after. Okay, so if you couldn't get Sass to install, don't worry. Okay, we'll have a look at it after this lesson. We won't use it today. We're going to use another way to compile Sass, which is much more convenient using a VS Code extension. Now, I'll tell you why this is more convenient. One is because it'll automatically recompile your Sass as you make changes. The second reason is you'll see by the end of today we're going to have multiple Sass files. And if you were compiling yourself manually, you would have to recompile all the files every time you make changes. Yes, Aiden?
So we're not actually going to interact with the Sass files.
I'm sorry? What?
Are we going to have to interact with the Sass files?
Yes.
So will I need the Sass still?
No, because we're going to use this. Okay, so look for, in extensions, look for the live Sass compiler and install it. And then once you have it installed, you should see this little watch Sass in the bottom, in your bottom little, whatever that bar is called, that little footer bar, next to go live.
I've got it installed.
So, do me a favor and launch code from the directory instead of the way that you launched it. So all of these tools are really fickle about the way you launch VS Code more than compiles. So go into the directory where the repo is, so CSS Sass responsive, CD into CSS Sass responsive. Okay, does everybody have Live Sass compiler installed? Number 1 and number 2, can you see watch Sass at the bottom of your VS Code now?
It shows that you.
There you go. Okay, so when you click on Watch Sass, then it will start watching your Sass files, your SCSS files, okay? And when you make changes to those files, it will recompile them, and it'll turn them into a CSS file, okay? Which is nice. It just does it for you, and you don't have to think about it. All right, so if you're using Sass, and you're making changes to your SCSS file and you're not seeing those changes reflected in Live Server, make sure that you have Watch Sass on. Okay? This is a super handy extension. Like this saves a lot of time. All right, so let's talk about some of the things.
She's not able to get that Live Sass compiler. You have to close VS Code and then launch it.
So did you have it installed already? No. Okay. So one thing, just like with Live Server, this Watch Sass extension can be really fickle about the way you open VS Code. So I always, when I'm working with web files and I'm using these extensions, I launch VS Code from the directory, the root directory of my project. So I'll go into the CSS Sass responsive directory, run code from there, because it does some things. It's got some path variables that it's using, and it can behave a bit unexpectedly if you don't launch VS Code from that directory. No? It's not working? You opened it from the root project?
The problem is the inside connection, is that? Can you access the marketplace now? No, it's like a connection.
I didn't try it. Make sure you don't have a proxy set.
She has a proxy.
Don't have a
That
proxy
was on
set
the
if you're on
course
C.
that
I know right now you're on C wireless though. So untake the proxy off. Everybody else is okay with your Watch Sass? Yeah, so turn your proxy off if you're on C wireless. And then it really should just be the setting that's in your networking thing that's going to affect that.
Oh, it's not installed. Yeah, so it's just installed. Yeah. Right. Very good. Okay, cool. Awesome. Now run your live server.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. All right. So variables. So CSS does allow us to use variables, like I mentioned, but it's a little bit clunkier. So you have to use this var function to refer to the variables. With Sass, we can use some pretty simple syntax to use variables, and the syntax is that we preface the variable name with a $sign, and we do that when we're declaring the variable and when we're using the variable. We use the $sign. Okay? So like with instance variables, what symbol do we use? The @ symbol. So it's similar to that. We have to always prefix the variable with a $sign when we use variables in CSS. Okay? So we can declare a variable with this syntax that you see here. So it's similar to other CSS syntax when we're defining properties, and we're setting properties to values. So it's variable with a $sign in front of it, colon, and the value ending with a semicolon, right? And then when we want to refer to that variable, then we use the $sign again, and we use that variable name in place of the thing it represents.
It's kind of like a super. Is it?
So it's not really like a super because we don't have classes involved here.
No, but in that, you can just call it. You don't have to.
So it's just a variable, right? Variables are just pointers to some piece of information. And instead of hard coding that information in, instead of referring to that information directly, we can have a variable store that information. Now that's a bit of a misnomer too, because the variable doesn't actually store anything. It's just a label, but it's a label that points to a memory location that's storing that information, and then we can just refer to that variable name, which is a label pointing to that memory location, instead of referring to the information directly. And we know already by now, right, why variables are really powerful. They're really useful. So they allow us to define things in one place and refer to that thing in multiple places. So if we decide we want to change that value, like here we're setting a background color. If we decide later, no, actually I want to use a different background color, well, if we're setting background color in 6 different places, then we've got to go change the background color in 6 different places. But if we've used a variable, then we can just set that information in one place. And if we want to change it, we change it in one place. And then it impacts all of those 6 different places where we're referring to that value, right? Which is a very powerful thing. It makes our code drier. It makes it much easier to maintain and read and understand. And that's why we use variables. Okay, so let's try this. I want you to pick a color for text and nav link background. Now, I decided actually not to set the nav link background color because I decided I didn't like it. But anyway, pick a color for the text and nav link background. So that's going to be your primary background color. And then pick a color for the content background. And then pick a font color used for the main text and a font color used for the headings. So you're going to pick 4 different colors. So right, I just want you to pick the colors. Pick 2 complementary Google fonts from Google Fonts, and then we're going to add these variables to our styles, which I spelled wrong. Stites, our stites. .scss.
So we're setting them in SCSS?
Yes, and your styles.scss. We're going to set these 6 different variables. So we're going to pick 2 colors for backgrounds, 2 colors for text, where the primary color is going to be against the primary background color, so make sure that they're nicely contrasted colors. And the secondary color is going to be on the secondary background color. Okay? So let me show you what the I posted a link to the wireframes for this, so I can show you. So it'll be something like this. So where this kind of, I don't know what that is, this kind of yellowish color is the primary background color. This kind of purplish color is the secondary background color. And then the primary font color, primary color is the one that goes against the primary background color. Okay? And the secondary color is going to go against the secondary background color. So pick colors that will contrast with each other. Now I chose, I'll show you what I choose. And then pick a couple of fonts from Google Fonts. So I picked Roboto and Leto, but you can pick 2 other fonts if you want to. Alright, and so while you guys are picking that, I'm going to update mine so you can see what I do. So I'm just going to go to my style, SCSS, and I'm going to define these variables. So I'm going to make my primary background color just white, and my secondary background color I'm going to make, I want mine to be like a dark purple. So I'm going to do this little trick where I mouse over and then pick a darker color. Like that'll work. My primary font color I'm just going to make black. My secondary font color I'm going to make white. So my secondary font color is going to go against that dark purple background, and my primary font color is going to go against the white background. Okay, so I've got some good contrast there. And then my primary font family, I'm going to use Roboto, I think. The colors, if you just hover over a color that you have there, it'll bring it up, and then you can change it. Now if you go to Google Fonts, and for example, if I pick Roboto and Leto, then it selects those, and if I open this little dialog, it gives me the import statement, and then it gives me what I need to specify in CSS to use that. So if I want to use Roboto for my primary font, then I just paste that in. And if I want to use Leto for my secondary font, I just paste that in. So in Google Fonts, you select the ones that you want, and then it'll add them to the selected dialog, and then you just look at the selected dialog, and you can look at, so you can see standard, and there's an import statement. We'll use the import statement, and this needs to go at the top of your SCSS file. Right now you'll see I have an import statement for normalize, so I'm including normalize to kind of get rid of defaults that I don't want in the browser and to fix some browser bugs like I mentioned on Wednesday, I think. and then I'm going to add the import statement for the two fonts that I want to use. And then I set those fonts with my primary font family and secondary font family variables. And you can see when I save this file, it actually generated the CSS. So if I look at outputs, and if I add a space here and save, oh, I don't have Watch Sass on, so you have to have Watch Sass on. So if you turn on Watch Sass,
And you put it in your HTML.
not in my HTML.
No, the import.
No, the import I put in my SCSS.
You just got an import. You just copy the import.
That's right. And you can see all it's generated so far in my CSS file is just those two import statements, because I haven't used those variables anywhere yet, so it hasn't produced any CSS yet related to that. But I've got them defined in my SCSS file. So if you haven't been able to find your own yet, you can take what I've got here for now and you can go change it later. It'll be really easy to change it, won't it? You'll just have to change it in this one spot if you want to change it. So I'll just paste this into Slack just in case you want to grab it. I'll put it in lessons. I'll put it in a snippet. Oops, that's not what I wanted. All right. Everybody okay for me to go on from here? Yeah? So will this have made any changes yet to our HTML file? No, it's not. So our HTML file, let's have a look at what we've got in the HTML file. Our HTML file has a link to our styles directory, style.css. So even when we're using Sass, what we want to refer to in our HTML file is the CSS, okay? The CSS gets generated by our Sass compiler. And right now we're using the one that's built into Visual Studio Code. So when we have Watch Sass turned on, see how it says watching now? Whenever I make changes to this SCSS file, it's going to regenerate the styles.css file. Style.css file. And our index.html is referring to that style.css file. But I haven't added any style yet. All I've done is declared some variables. That's all I've done. I'm not using them and I haven't defined any styles yet. So this hasn't made any changes yet to what we see in the browser. Does that make sense? We've got to add some styles before we can see changes in the browser. All right. So let's do that. Let's use the variables to set the color styles and the font styles. So we're going to set the background color in container to secondary background color. The background color for main text, main nav to primary background color. The font color and family for main text, main image, and anchor tags to the primary font color and primary font family. And the font color and family for header to the secondary font color and secondary font family. So let's have a look at the HTML to see what we have here. I'm just going to close up the sections for a minute so I can show you what the structure of this page looks like. So we have a div container, you see that, which contains everything in the body. Okay? And that div container has 4 sections. The top one is called main nav, and if we look at that section, it just has our two anchor tags with links to home and to resources, which is just further down the page. Okay? So that's in a nav element, and that nav element is contained in a section with the ID main nav. So below that, I've got a main section, and that main section contains a header, and it contains one section called main primary, which has a class of main text, and it has a second section called main image, which contains an image, and then there's a third section called main secondary, which also has a main text class. And what that allows me is to apply consistent styling to the way that the text is appearing in each of those two text sections, okay, using the main text class. And I can identify them separately, though, so that if I want to change the way that they are laying out on the page, for example, I've got like a separate handle to each one of those sections, which we'll use later today when we do responsive design. So those three sections make up the main section in the container. And then I have a resources section, which has a header, it has a nav, and it has a section which also has main text styling class on it called resources content. So I've named each one of these sections so I have handles on them so I can apply styling. And notice that I'm using semantic tags here instead of non-semantic tags. So that's my resources section. It contains a header and those where'd it go? This is the thought of it part. All right. So my resources section contains the header, which has a nav in it. And I'm sorry, it doesn't have a nav in it. It has a header, has a nav, and has the resources content section. And then I have a footer. And the footer just has a couple of images that I'm using to link to my socials. Okay? So if you look back at what this slide tells us to do, we're going to set the background color and container, which is the div that contains everything, okay, to the secondary background color. So it's sort of just going to frame the content in those other sections with a background color. And then I want main text, main nav, those two sections to have my primary background color. So that's white for me. And then I'm going to set the font colors and families to primary or secondary, depending on how I set the background. Does that make sense? So the first step is for container, setting the secondary background color. So how do I do that? What do I have to add here? Containers and ID.
Some hashtag content.
Yep. And then I'm going to set which property?
Primary background color.
So the property is background color, right? And what I'm going to set it to is my primary background color variable. Yeah? Now if I save that, you'll see it regenerated the CSS. And look what I have in my CSS now. This got added to my CSS. And if I look at my live server, let me just restart my live server. It hasn't changed anything. Oh, because I didn't want to set it to the primary background color, sorry. Set it to the secondary. It's like, that didn't change anything. So the container should be set to the secondary background color. Now everything is dark purple for me. Okay, the second thing I want to do is to set the background color for main text and main nav. So where main text is a class, remember, because I want to apply it to multiple sections. So So how can I set the background color for main text and main nav? How can I set the background color for main text?
You just got to call the main text.
It's a class, so I'm going to do it like that. And I want to set the background color. So look at your style CSS Vic first and see if it's updated with your changes. Your CSS isn't updated? So is your watch Sass on?
Yeah, but it's
Now,
it's not what changed for some reason.
well then it's not.
It doesn't.
You also need to, if you keep this output open in your VS Code, you'll see if there are any errors. And also you'll see when I make a change, like if I want to add my color to main text to my primary font color, you'll see that it gives me a little green success at the bottom when it recompiles, and then it goes back to watching. And then I should see those changes happen. Yeah? At the very bottom, so watch when I make a change. So if I change the, let's change for, what did I say, for header? Yeah. So for header, if I set the color to the secondary font color, see down here it does this little green check success at the bottom of my screen, and then it goes back to watching. So that should have just changed my header color to white. Now I want to set my font family to for main text to my primary font family. So that changed the font. Now I also need to set, see I haven't set it for nav yet. I'm also supposed to set for main nav, set my background color to the primary, and set color to the primary font color. Now even though I'm just setting it as black and that's the default, I'm still going to use these variables in case I want to change it later. So I changed my nav. And also font family to primary font family. And in the header, I'm going to set font family to secondary font family. Now if I look at my CSS, I've got a bunch more CSS in here now. And you can see that the variable names get replaced with their values. Okay? So now I'm looking like this. I can.
There's some website.
You don't have to keep doing that. So just leave it alone. It's watching, it generated. So, you're not live. You get one? This is okay? Yeah. So now you need to set, now let me switch back to the Sass. Hold on, because I'm showing the style. So I've got
Yes, it's just three things: main text, main text
So if you're getting stuck or things aren't working the way you expect it to, let me know so I can come have a look and help you out. I can copy paste it.
Just for reference, in
Mhm.
case someone doesn't.
So what I'm doing is I'm setting up some basic styling for these areas of my page, and because I'm using variables, I could pretty quickly change colors and see how things look in lessons. So for example, this is what it looks like right now for me. And maybe, I think, I'm not real sure about, maybe I want more of a blue color. So I can just mouse over here. And then maybe I'll give this one a try. Save that. We'll regenerate my Sass. And then I can have a look.
Now you can just.
So you can see it'd be really easy for me to change my color scheme up. I just have to change colors in one place, and I can try different things and see how I like it, which is pretty cool. All right, everybody okay there? Colors and fonts. I did paste it into Slack. Aiden, if you want to. Any questions about what we've done so far? Okay, so I pasted it in Slack if you need to look at that some more. Let's see, did I do everything in here? So header, font color and family for, okay, I forgot about the anchor tags and main image. So let me do that. So main image is the section that's around my image. So in main image and for anchor tags, I'm going to set the font color and family. So let's do that. So for main image, color, and I want it to be, what I want it to be, primary. Font family. And then anchor tags. Let's see. Which didn't actually change anything on my page because of my color choices, but if you had different color choices, then you would see some difference there. And if I decide I want to change my primary font color from black to something else, then you would be able to see that. But it did change my font family, which is nice. So now my font families are consistent on the whole page. So I'll copy and paste these two into Slack as well. So we're just setting primary font color and font family, and main image and anchor. Okay, so I think that's everything in there. Yep. All right. Okay, so another thing that we can do with Sass, besides defining variables, which is super cool, is that we can use nesting. We can nest our style declarations instead of using spaces or putting property names next, like a property name, class name, element name, class name right next to each other. We can use nesting. Yes, Aiden? Say again? I can't hear you. It's not changing your styles?
Put it in the CSS or
no.
to put it in your style?
Do you have watch?
CSS?
Have you clicked the watch Sass?
Yeah.
Is it watching?
Yeah.
It is. Do you have any? It says success. And then you look at your style. So click on style CSS for me. So what Aiden just had was it was watching and it was saying that it was updating the CSS, but it wasn't. If that happens to you, sometimes so this extension can be slightly buggy. Sometimes it's still to me totally worth using because it's way easier than the alternative. When that happens, you can just delete your CSS file, okay, and then just make a small change in your SCSS, like add a space or something, and save and make it regenerate the CSS file. It'll regenerate the whole file, yeah. So if you find that it's not updating your CSS, then it could just be an issue with the Watch CSS extension. Just delete the CSS and have it regenerated, okay? So even with the little minor bugs that it's got, to me, it's still way worth using because the alternative is we'd have to go to the terminal every time we update the Sass and recompile the CSS. And that is painful, especially when we have multiple Sass files, and you do write a script to do it, but you'd still have to run that script every time you make changes, and that's kind of a pain. So I still like the plugin, the extension. Okay, so nesting is another thing we can do. So in regular CSS, if we wanted to target a descendant of an element or of a class or something, then we would use this kind of syntax, right? So if we wanted to target only the anchor tags in our main nav area, for example, to set a background color, then we could do it like this, which is okay. All right, there's nothing wrong with that. But in Sass, we can do this nesting. And you'll see when it compiles to CSS, it'll create this for you. But the nice thing about nesting is that it, in my opinion, is easier to see really clearly where we're defining the styles. Okay? So here we're defining the anchor tag inside of the stanza for our main nav. And so we know we're only going to impact anchor tags that are defined inside of that main nav. Okay? So for me, that's more intuitive than doing this. It's going to compile down to this, but we can write it like this in our Sass. So I like that. I think it's nice. And then when we want to apply a style to a class or an ID or a pseudo class, then instead of using this, basically we do the same thing but without the space. So we put the element identifier, and right next to it we put either dot class name or hash ID name or colon pseudo class name. So instead of that, we can nest it. Now when we're going to nest an ID or a class or a pseudo class, we have to use this ampersand in front of the selector for that class ID or pseudo class, which effectively removes that space from the CSS that gets compiled. So it compiles down to this. Okay? But the same way we can say we want to define hover styles, but just for image. All right? So we're going to do something like this for, we're going to update a couple of things. One is for our main nav links, the anchor tags in our main nav section. We're going to apply an inline block display setting. So if we want to put some background around those links to make them stand out, then we can set a defined width on those so it looks good instead of just like these arbitrary lengths, widths based on the content of the link. We're going to set a consistent width to 5 EM and align the text in that 5 EM space to the center so that the links just appear a bit more consistent in the nav bar. So we're going to do that using nesting to define those styles on anchor tags and main nav. If you wanted to set a background color on those anchor tags, you could too, to your secondary background color, and that'll make them kind of stand out a bit. And then the second thing we're going to do is set the width and height of the social images links. So if you look right now, they're like these giant things. That's a bit weird. So, by the way, I do have some other versions of these. I just have like the blue version in the images directory and a white version without a border. So if you want to use one of those, you can too. But anyway, we're going to set the width and height to 30 pixels, and on hover we'll set them to 40 pixels, and that gives us a simple little CSS animation effect where it looks like they get bigger when you mouse over them. Okay, so to do that second one, it looks just like this on this slide. Okay, so we set the width and the height of the image to 30 pixels and the hover. Now we only want to do this inside, not for all images, because we have another image on our page too, don't we? We have that computer image. We don't want to set its width and height. So how can we select just the images in the footer? Yeah, we can use footer. So let's do the main nav links first. So in my style CSS, I've already got a main nav section here. So if I want to apply styles just to the anchor tags in there.
Oh, so you're in the SCSS?
I'm in the SCSS always. I'm not modifying the CSS anymore, ever.
So
In main nav, and I want to set display to inline block, and that's just going to allow me to set width on the anchor tags. And so I'm going to set width to 5 EM, and I'm going to align the text in the center within that 5 EM width for the anchor tags. Is it text align? Because it doesn't like this, yeah. There we go, text align, not align text. Was that what I have in the slide? Yeah, okay, good. Okay, so that's the first thing. Now if we look at what this looks like, you probably can't see a huge difference, but it did space them apart some more. And I could set the background color. I'm not going to on mine, but I'm just going to show you what it looks like to the secondary background color. And if I do that, it puts like, and if I did that, I would want to change the font color as well. So I'd want to set the color to the secondary font color so I can see them. But I'm not super happy with how that looks.
the other way around?
So the way it is without these is it's set to the primary because I've set the primary on main nav and it's going to inherit that. Right? So I like it like that, but you can, if you want to use your secondary background color and secondary font color on those anchor tags, you could. So that takes care of the first bit.
It doesn't look like a map.
So it isn't going to look incredibly different. It's just going to be spaced a bit more. There's just a bit more space between them because I've set a uniform width on them. The other thing that I want to add is in for the images in the footer. So how can I target the images in the footer?
You will put it in the image.
If I just put in an image, that's going to apply to all images.
No, if you put it in main image.
I don't want it in main image. I want to change these down here. So I could put it in footer. So in image and footer, I'm going to set the width to 30 pixels and the height to 30 pixels. So if I just change that at first, then look, it made my little icons a more...
I can tag in maybe I didn't do it right. You go back to your CSS.
Yep.
You've got your main image and you've got
so this is what I've added to main nav. Yeah, Aiden? Do you have a semicolon at the thing above it? Yeah, I don't want a background color on mine. But if you want it, you can add it.
And then you're going where?
And then footer. And if I want that hover effect, how do I specify that? And I'm going to set the width to 40 pixels and the height to 40 pixels on hover. And then when I go over here and it's freaking out. Oh, I did. Thank you. It should be inside of image. Inside of image. Thanks, Carly. That's better. Okay, Aiden, are you still stuck there? Okay, so image, we're setting width and height, so width and height to 30 pixels. How's everybody else going? Yeah? Good? All good? Okay, I'll copy this into...
Is it supposed to when you hover and change or not?
Yes. So make sure the hover's inside of image and footer, because I did it wrong the first time.
Yeah, it is, but it's not done. Maybe I'll put it on.
And you set it to 40 pixels in the hover.
Yeah.
And your Sass output shows that everything's okay. And you can have a look at your CSS. So if we look at the CSS now, you'll see that we've got a footer image styling and a footer image hover styling.
Yeah, but it's not done here in the hover.
And it should look like that when you hover.
Now.
Yeah?
Now it's still. I have to refresh it.
Okay.
I had to refresh it, should I?
Not necessarily, but again, these are these extensions aren't always perfect, but they're really nice. I'm happy with how well they work. Okay, now let's talk about mix-ins. Mix-ins are probably like my favorite thing, and because they're really powerful. So like variables, they help to keep our code really dry. You can define a set of properties once in a mix-in, and then just include that mix-in wherever you want those properties to be applied on an element. So the syntax for a mix-in is @ mix-in. You give it a name, and then you put properties inside of curly braces. So for example, if you look at our page right now, there's a lot of places where it needs some space. So there's, we could use some space around stuff, right? Everything's like pushed right up against to the edges, and that's not super attractive. So we could definitely add some space. Now we could go add some space variables to each one of these. Oh, Ash. We could go add some space variables to each one of these, or we could define a mix-in that defines the space properties that we want. And then this will allow us to easily change it later if we want to. If we decide that we want the spacing to be slightly different, we don't have to go change it everywhere. We can just change it in this one place. So just like variables, it's a lot like variables. It gives us one place to define something, and then we can use that definition wherever we want. But like a variable allows us to set sort of like one attribute. A mix-in lets us define any number of properties and give that set of property settings a name, which is super powerful, right? So let's create a space mix-in. But first, let me just show you how you use it. So once you define a mix-in, then you can just include it wherever you want to use it, just like that.
You
so
just
you
gotta
say,
call it at the start. You just gotta call it at the start.
You just define it.
Yeah.
Yeah, at the start. Yeah, you just declare it at the start of your SCSS. And in a minute, we're going to talk about modularizing all of this, so we'll actually end up putting it in a different file. But for now, we're just going to declare it at the top, and then we can refer to it. We can include it wherever we want to. So let's add a space mix-in with a margin and padding set to 0.5 EM, and we'll include it in main text, main nav, footer, nav, main image, and anchor and main nav. So that's a lot of places that we would have to go add those two properties if we wanted to add those two properties everywhere. And if we decided we wanted the spacing to be different, we'd have to change it in all those places. So by putting the specification of the property values in the mix-in, that's going to save us a lot of headache. So first we'll define the mix-in at the top. So mix-in, we'll call it space, and we're going to set margin.
Why didn't you have primaries and then background color and stuff at the top? Where's that?
I'm in the wrong file, that's why. So don't do, you have to be really careful. Aiden just did that too. Just keep it closed. I had it open so I could show you guys. So we'll put it underneath our variable declarations. And margin. And padding. And then we'll include it. Where did I say to include it? Main text, main nav. Now if we include it in nav, we actually don't need it in main nav. So I'm not sure why I had it in both.
So, hang on.
It doesn't matter that it's at the top of the, I just like to put my mix-ins at the top of each each place that I'm using, yeah.
Why do you call it at include? Why isn't it at
That's right.
mixing space? Why is it at include, not at mixing space?
Because you use at mixin where you declare it, what it is, where you define it, but where you want to use it, you use at include. And then you give the name of the mixin, and then open close parens. Now the open close parens aren't strictly needed, but we're going to talk about that in a minute, okay? So space nav, what else did I say? Main nav, I'm going to leave it out of main nav for the moment though. Main image, I put main nav in there twice, and anchor and main nav. Okay.
Where have you put it?
So in nav, in main text, in anchor and main nav,
Where's
you have to add nav.
Oh, you have to add now.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And in main image.
After the mixing. You know,
It doesn't matter too much where you've got it at the moment.
main text. And then you add it now.
Mm-hmm. So it could be good to have your more general things declared actually above the more specific things, but it's not going to matter too much in this particular case. So let's just see how this is looking. So did I put it in header?
Inside the header? Did you put it inside the header?
I didn't put it inside the header, but
No, main did you put it on the anchor tag and main image or not?
yes. No, not in main image, in main nav. Anchor tag and main nav.
Put it in the footer?
I didn't put it in footer.
In the header?
I didn't put it in header.
Okay. Can you just save it?
So right now I'm like this. So this is looking a bit better. Now we really should be looking at this in mobile layout, but we'll do that later. So we're designing for mobile first. Okay? Okay, so we have parentheses and the include syntax. And if there are no arguments, you don't have to include the parentheses, but I just would, okay? But what you can take from that, though, is we can pass arguments to our mixin, which is pretty cool. So that just gives us more flexibility, right? Say that there are some properties we want to set some way in some cases and other ways in other cases. We can pass those values in as arguments to our mixin. It just gives us more flexibility with that mixin. We can even specify default arguments and keyed arguments. So do you guys remember when we talked about default arguments and keyed arguments with Ruby? So when we can specify a default value for an argument, and if we give the argument a name, then that's called a keyed argument. Now, I would always use default keyed arguments just because it gives you more flexibility and it's not that much work to do that. It also makes your arguments, your mixin super explicit, which I think is nice. Okay? So let's look at an example where we might want to do this. So right now we set font color and family to our primary values in two places, at least two places, and in the secondary color and family in one place in the header. We could define a mixin called font settings that sets the color and family to primary by default, since that's what we're doing in most cases, but allows setting them to the secondary. So we just pass arguments. So you could just say like color 1, color 2 here, you know, and just use that, but I'm using default and keyed arguments. So I'm naming the argument, I'm calling an argument color, and then by default I'm setting it to my primary font color. And then I'm naming a second argument family, and then I'm setting a default value of the primary font family. Okay? Then inside of my mixin, I'm setting properties. I'm setting the color property to whatever color is either passed in or set by default. And I'm setting font family, that property, to the family that's my second argument, which will be set to the primary font family by default. Is that clear for everybody? That syntax, what I'm doing there? Yeah? So, so when we want to set it to the primary, we don't even have to pass it any arguments. Okay? It's only if we want to set either the color or the family to something other than what we set as the primary that we need to pass in an argument. We can pass in either of these arguments or both of those arguments because we've keyed them. Okay? And we've set defaults. So let's add a font settings mixin, like the one we have on the previous slide, and we'll use the mixin where we're currently setting the color and the family. Okay? Let's do that first. So we're going to add a mixin. Font settings, and it's going to take two arguments. It's going to take a color, which you're going to set by default to our primary, and it's going to take a family, which we're going to set to default by default to our primary font family, and we're going to set the color property to the color that's passed in, and the font family property to the family that's passed in. Now that we've defined this mixin, anywhere that we're doing this, we can just we can just include our mixin instead. So instead of doing that, we can just say include font settings, and then we can get rid of these two lines. So we look for where we're setting font color and family, and then we replace it with a call to our mixin. Yes, so by default we're setting color to primary font color, and by default we're setting family to primary font family. And
do you have to give it a bracket? Yes.
Syntax needs to be just like this. Here, I'll paste this into Slack. Now once you define the mixin, all there is to do is to call it everywhere you're currently setting font color and family. Okay? So in most places we can call it with no arguments because we're using default keyed arguments. More specifically because we're using default arguments. And then here in header, where we're setting it to secondary, we can still use our mixin, but we're going to pass it secondary font color and secondary font family. Okay.
Where did you change it?
So in header, where we're setting color and font family to secondary, you can delete it. So hopefully that's clear how that's cleaning up our code. So wherever you're setting font color, wherever you're setting color and font family right now, replace that with including the font settings mixed in.
So what you do is you say include space, font,
Okay, is that clear for everybody what we're doing there?
And then we don't put the thing in.
No.
Then we don't put it in.
No. You need to put it. You need to put font.
So if you're going to use the defaults, Vic, which is primary,
Yeah.
font color and family, you don't have to pass any arguments because we're setting those defaults when we define the mix-in. And we're doing that so we can do this, for one thing, because it just makes our code a bit nicer.
So,
Can you just scroll up? Can you just scroll up to the header? Scroll down to your
Scroll
header.
down, right.
Header. Yeah.
But in the one place where we're setting to secondary font color and family, we need to pass in those arguments. Now we could name them like this. It's not necessary because we're passing both. This will, in this case, is exactly the same thing. What this allows us to do, though, having them keyed, allows us to, if we wanted to only pass in the color or only the family, then we could just pass one or the other. Because we've keyed them, we're allowed to do that. So this, you don't have to name them because I'm passing both arguments, and there are only 2 arguments. But it's nice to have a convention or a practice of naming them when the arguments are named, because if I change my mix-in later and I wanted to add some more arguments, then this isn't going to break, right? This won't break. If I added another argument later to my mix-in, this is still going to work.
Yeah.
Okay? In main image, I'm including font settings too, just the default settings. Yeah. So this didn't change anything at all in the way my page looks. I'm just cleaning up the code. Okay? I'm just making the code drier and easier to maintain.
And then where else did we do that? That was one. Did you say put it in all places? You can put it in.
What's that?
You can put it in all places. Where did you put it now?
So I included that everywhere we're setting color and font family. So instead of setting those explicitly in there, I'm calling my mix-in, using my mix-in instead.
So here?
Yeah. All places where I'm using color and font family. And I think you did right. Yeah. Yes.
Can I? Are you going to go in forward?
I could. Yeah, or I can wait. I can wait.
Probably just explain.
Yeah. Yeah.
I think she's done.
Yeah. So all we're doing is replacing explicit setting of properties with inclusion of our mix-in. That's all we're doing. We define the mix-in and we call that instead of specifying those properties in each section. Okay?
So that's yeah.
Any questions?
We're giving a different argument.
Okay.
Yeah. So and if you don't press it, it'll get the
That's right, Vic.
yeah.
All right. Okay. So, but wait, there's more. Yes.
Now, some uses this really like
So we're still going to use, we're going to use Sass. From now on, we are only going to ever, modify SCSS files. Don't use CSS anymore. Okay? Don't use it for anything. Use Sass instead. If you're doing something super tiny and you need like this much CSS and it's never ever going to change or grow, fine. Just use CSS. But that's like never. That's never going to be the case. So use Sass. On your portfolio, use Sass. It's not in the rubric, but I will not be happy if you don't use Sass. Okay? Use Sass in the portfolio. All right? Because you're going to see when we're done with this lesson today, right now, the line-to-line ratio is quite similar. At the end of today, it won't be. After we add all the responsive design, the CSS is going to be like this, and our Sass is going to be like these little tiny files. Okay? And that's what I have to look at when I mark your work. Don't give me 2,000 lines of CSS to look at, because I'll get so grumpy. Because it's terrible to look at. No, don't do that. Don't do that.
Well, we can do that in our portfolio.
No, we didn't. And then I had to mark some of those, and it was total shit. Okay? So I'm not doing that again. I'm just not. All right? All right, so let's add, let's change our space mix-in to take arguments for margin and padding. And then we're going to use this a bit later. Okay, so just change your space mix-in. Now you'll notice that we can change our space mix-in without breaking anything where we're using it. Okay, so we're just going to add two arguments. We're going to add an argument called margin, and by default we're going to set it to 0.5 EM. And then we're going to add an argument called padding, and by default we're going to set it to 0.5 EM. And then what are we going to change here? What am I going to put here? Dollar margin. And what am I going to put here? That's right. Oops. And that didn't change anything, right? That changed nothing. I didn't have to change where I'm including this mix-in because I've said defaults, but it gives me some flexibility now. Now I can use this mix-in and maybe just set, margin, or just set padding, or set them to a different value than what my default value is in like one particular place. Okay? I'll stick this in Slack. All right. But wait, there's more. Okay, so I think there's just this little bit about why we use default keyed arguments, which I think I've explained pretty well. But because we've used keyed arguments as well means that we could just specify one or the other. It also means, like I was mentioning, if later we decided to add more arguments to our mix-in, it wouldn't break anywhere that we're currently using it if we always use keyed arguments. And if we always provide default arguments when we add them to a mix-in, then we won't break anybody who's not passing those arguments. Okay? So that's really important. So what I want to do now is I want to add some styling to the anchor tag in resources nav. Because if you look right now, that resources nav link is primary background color, but it's against the secondary. I mean, it's primary font color, but it's against the secondary background color, and so it doesn't show up properly. But But the nav bar at the top is against the primary background color. So I just want to change the color of the anchor tag in resources nav to the secondary font color. Okay? So anchor tag inside of resources nav, can use nesting for that. Anchor tag inside of resources nav to the secondary font color. How do I do that? Somebody tell me. Somebody tell me. I already have a resources now, do I? No, okay. So let's add a resources now. And then what am I gonna put in here? What am I gonna put? A. And then what am I gonna do? Call font settings or include. And I'm gonna set the color only to secondary font color. And what that does, I'll show you, is it turns that link, see, so I can see it against my background now, because it was set to the primary font color. So this is all I've done. And I don't want to change the family. I want the family to be what it is for the other anchor tags. I just want to change the color, because in my version of this anyway, it doesn't, you know, I'm using the primary font color against the secondary background color, and I can't see it very well. Okay? Now we're going to do one more thing, I think. Yes. So the other thing is that is our image styling. So we use image in the figure. Actually changed it from a figure. Image and the main image, and in the footer links. And in both places we could use some padding, but by adding margin isn't really appropriate, because it's going to double the space between these elements and their neighbors. That's not really what I don't want to add more margin. I just want to add some more padding around those images. So if we look right now, if I added more margin, that's not good. You can see it better with these. I just want to add some padding between those images. So if I just wanted to add padding to images in both places, then I could do it with image. I don't have an image tag yet, do I? Just a point, but only inside of other things. So I could add include space padding 0.5 em.
Whatever the primary is, because it is 0.5.
I don't have a variable yet that no, so the default is 0.5, but by default I set both margin and padding. And actually it's going to do the same thing, isn't it? So if I only want to set,
you only want to set padding,
then actually this isn't what I want to do. What do I want to do?
you want to go
margin 0 and padding will get set to the default. So if I don't want to set margin, then I can set margin to 0, and I can let padding get set to the default.
How is that doing that?
Because by default, if I look at my space mix in, it's setting 0.5. Yeah, for both.
Right.
So if I pass in a margin of 0,
What does it do to the image?
the image, it doesn't, you can just see it adds a bit more space. We still have layout issues, which we'll fix in responsive design. But it just adds some space between these two at the bottom, so they're not right next to each other. Now I'm feeling like we need some margin around the headers, don't we? Or some padding. They're right up against the edge, so let's add some of that. I can't remember if I do in the next one or not. So for header, if we include space, let's just try, oops.
I've got the things in 20 seconds, alright.
Yeah, you should. So if I include some space in header, that looks better, doesn't it?
What did you put in the parentheses now?
Nothing. Okay.
Is that for all headings?
So yeah, we have 2 headers, and that's going to apply to both of them.
Right, but not the menu.
No, because that's not a header. All right, so this is pretty powerful, right? So far, the things we looked at, variables and mixins, are really cool. And nesting, all those things are super cool to make our CSS much more readable for the poor people who have to read our CSS, which might also be you. You know, 2 weeks after you write it, and you look back at that stuff. Have you had that experience yet? You have a mountain with CSS, and you look back at it like 2 weeks later, and you're like, what the hell was I doing here? It's like so confusing. Yeah. Well, then you're one of the lucky ones. Because every time I look at a mountain of CSS after I initially write it, yeah. Well, CSS can grow really massively. You'll find when you work in your portfolio that your CSS might get kind of massive, okay? We can also modularize our CSS, our Sass, which is so nice. And what I mean by this is we can, in addition to defining variables and mixins, which does do some modularization for us, we can put stuff in separate files, okay? And this is really nice for a number of reasons. So what are some reasons it's nice to have our stuff in separate files? Somebody give me some reasons.
Keeps it organized.
Yeah, it keeps it organized for sure.
Not have one monolithic file.
Yeah, one monolithic file is never a pleasant thing for anyone.
Multiple CS files can access the different variables.
Yes, yes, that's true. And yes, so we can define the variables in one place, and then we can have multiple Sass or CSS files that, it would be Sass files, multiple Sass files that read in those variables. It could be CSS too.
One swap themes.
Say again?
Yep, one swap them in like this. Are you able to do that? Like if you have, say you have one particular Sass to override on mobile because it's desktop,
Yeah.
is that something doable? So if you were to say define 2 different styles,
Yeah,
you
so
could sort of swap them out relatively easily.
you could. Yeah, yeah. We're going to use media queries and single Sass files to do that, but you could. The other thing is if you're collaborating with people, it's much easier always to do collaboration if things are separated into separate files. It's less likely you're going to have merge conflicts if stuff's in separate files, right? You can kind of separate who's doing what. So we can define things in separate files, and then we just have to import those files into our SCSS file. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to create a helpers directory and our styles directory. So in our styles directory, we'll create a helpers directory, and that's going to hold our variables and mixins. So we're going to create a helpers directory. We're going to create a file called variables.scss. Yes?
So we're just thinking Sass file right here, and we're going to do the old one first. Because I wasn't able to catch up.
So we're going to create these new files. We're going to move stuff around. We're going to move stuff out of our style.scss into these other files. Okay? We're going to end up with an SCSS file that only has import statements in it and nothing else. All right? So we're going to create a variable SCSS, and we're going to put all the variable declarations in there in our helpers subdirectory. And then we're going to create a mixins.scss, and guess what goes in there?
So,
All their mixin definitions go in there.
in our
Yeah.
terminal, you're in Sass responsive, you have to go to style.
Yeah, so you could do it in VS Code. So if you click on the styles directory and click on the little add new folder button, we're going to create a folder called helpers. And then we're going to click on that helpers folder and we're going to create a new file. Click the new file icon and create one called variables.scss. And then we're going to click on our helpers file again and add another file called mixins.scss. So now we have two files in our helpers directory. Yeah? So you create a directory helpers, and inside the helpers directory, you create these two files. If you create it in the wrong place, just drag it into the right place.
So it's in the helpers file.
Yep,
Oh,
so
but
now,
my mixins doesn't have a little SCSS on it.
well, it should. So rename it.
The extension should be.
The extension needs to be SCSS on these files.
Oh.
Okay? So rename it if yours does not.
But it does have mixin SCSS.
Okay.
Why doesn't it? Oh. Because it's not
Is it a directory? So you should have a directory with two files in it.
I'll usually close off the code one.
Now we're going to go to Style, SCSS. And we'll add or include our import statements first.
So we're in our styles SCSS.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to import those two files.
Without the CSS.
Nope, you don't have to put the extension. It assumes that that's what you're doing. It doesn't hurt if you do put it, but it assumes that you're importing SCSS files. Then we're going to grab these variables, declarations. We're going to cut them. And where am I going to put them?
Variable.
Yeah.
So hang on. Oh, you cut the
I just cut the variable declarations out, and I stuck them in the variables SCSS file.
and it's called variable.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, mine's called variable.
Well, I would call it variables because you have multiple variables in there. And then what do you think I'm going to do next?
And
Cut them from style SCSS and put them in variables SCSS.
does it have anything to do with the variable CSS or not? It just has
Say again?
It's in the variable CSS, just
Variables, just the variables. That's it. All right, now I'm going to go to Style SCSS and cut the mixin declarations out and stick them in mixins SCSS.
So there's only two, right?
Yep.
For some reason I got the yellow.
Now you'll notice that when I save those, it generates CSS files, but there's nothing in them because I don't actually have any style declarations in those files. Okay?
And I'm using
Now let's just make sure I didn't break my site. Nope, it's all still good. So I didn't change anything. Okay, all I've done is I've just made my code a bit more modular. Is everybody back there following along with this? All good? You got your stuff in separate files? Now, when you do your portfolio assessment, guys, hey, when you do your portfolio assessment, I expect you to separate your work into separate files like this too. Okay? All right?
So you got your
Okay. But wait, there's more.
Fantastic.
There are partials. Partials is another way to make our code dry. Now this is just also creating separate files and putting styling in those separate files. But the cool thing about partials is that we name them with an underscore character in front of the file name. And the way that it gets compiled is into a single CSS file. Okay? Which is good for performance of our site if we have a single CSS file. But it allows us to do our development with our stuff in separate files, which is awesome. Okay? So, the only convention we have to follow is we have to have the underscore character. Okay? But when you import it, you don't use the underscore. All right? You only have to use the underscore in the file name. And then SCSS recognizes, the Sass compiler recognizes, this is a partial. I'm just going to grab all the stuff out of this, compile it into CSS, and put it in my main CSS file, my one single CSS file. And it will do that in the order you specify the import statements. Okay, so you do have to keep that in mind because, you know, CSS, for cascading style sheets, so that will affect the way that things turn out. You have to consider the order that you're putting things in. Okay, so let's do that. Let's create a partials directory in our styles directory. So we have a helpers directory. We're going to create a partials directory. And we're going to create a page SCSS that's going to hold our nav and footer stuff, because that's the stuff that appears on every page. Okay, even though we only have a one-page site at the moment, that might not always be true. So we're going to create a page SCSS, an underbar home SCSS, which is going to contain the content that's in the home section of our site.
So we create free
And the resources SCSS. Yeah, we're going to do this together. And we're going to import those things into our page.scss. So first in styles, we're going to select styles, add a new folder. We're going to add a folder called partials. Okay? That's in our styles folder. Yes? And then we're going to add one file called page_page.scss. Select partials, new file, underscore home SCSS. Select partials, new file, underscore resources SCSS. Okay? So we have those three new files and a partials directory, which is in our styles directory. Now the first thing we'll do is we'll go to style SCSS and we'll import these things. So we're going to import partials page.
style SCSS.
Yes. Import partials home. Oops. I don't know what happened here. And then import partials resources. So I just defined those 3 files, and I'm going to import them in my style.scss. And guess what I'm going to do next? I'm going to gut this baby. I'm going to take all the styles out of here and put them where they belong.
Hang on.
Mm-hmm.
Can you copy paste the side and everything in that folder that's styles basically?
What do you mean everything in the folder?
I felt behind it.
So just you have to create, have you created these directories? You've got to do.
Yeah, I've got all that. I just need the container name, text, all that stuff.
Oh, this stuff, yeah. All right, I'll do them one at a time as we paste them over, okay? And I'll tell you where to put them. Okay, so we're going to take nav
Just nav
and main nav.
and main nav.
We're going to leave header where it is. Let's take nav and main nav.
And do you have resources nav? Do you want that as well?
No.
But it's going to go somewhere else, yes.
It's all like this.
I will.
This goes like copy paste.
I will. In Slack?
Yeah, it's fine. So.
That's all right. Okay, so here's the first bit.
Nav,
Nav.
main nav.
Nav and main nav, and we're going to put it in page.
Put it in page.
Mhm.
.scss.
Yep. Then we're going to go back to style. And I'm going to leave resources nav where it is because it's really a part of the resources page and the styling around it. I want to keep with that. I'm going to grab the footer though.
Just the footer.
Yeah, the footer paragraph, because that's going to be on every page of my site. I'm going to cut that. And the footer I'm also going to put in page. So these are the parts that are going to show up on
Nav,
every
main
page
nav,
in footer.
and footer.
Okay?
What nav is that little thing down the bottom here?
Main nav is at the top.
Oh,
This is the nav at the top of the page.
and the page nav is what nav?
Nav is for any nav. I'm just including space. Main nav is the nav bar across the top,
Yeah,
and footer is the part across the bottom.
right.
And I'm putting those in page SCSS because if I did add more pages to the site, those things would be on every page, and I would want to style them consistently. I would just want to have one style for every page for those particular parts. Okay, now we're going to go back to style, and I'm going to take the resources nav. I'm going to cut that.
It's got resources nav. Yep.
And I'm going to put that in resources SCSS.
It's the only thing in resources so far.
Yep.
Right.
And then I'm going to go grab everything else. Remove some extra spaces.
Where's the style on?
So I'm going to grab everything else, cut it out, and I'm going to put it in home.
Everything else, the includes and everything.
No, just the styling.
So just the container, the main text,
Header, main, image, anchor, and image.
and image.
So all that should be left in style SCSS are my import statements.
Okay.
That's
What
it.
did you put down?
All of those stay in style SCSS. So basically
No, no,
style...
no. Where did
Oh,
you
that
put
went
the
into
cut
home.
thing?
Home. Yes.
So,
So, yeah, so now my style SCSS just kind of pulls everything together in the order I want it to populate my CSS file. Okay? Now if I go look at my CSS file now, first of all, let's look at the page and make sure I didn't break anything. Yep, it all looks the same. Okay, so I haven't changed anything. I've just moved stuff around. Now if I look at my style CSS, so there's not much to it yet. It's only, what, 71 lines, and it's got nice spacing in it.
Hang on. Go to
I'm just looking at the style CSS.
style
but my style SCSS is only imports. My page SCSS has only the Sass that's related to the whole page. My home SCSS has the stuff that's on my home page content, the styling for that. And my resources SCSS has only the styling for that resources part of my page. So when I look at your portfolio assessment, this is what your style SCSS should look like. It should only have import statements.
Why do you have accents to
Pages, that's right. And then home. Do you have a home? That's all your other stuff. Yeah. No, that's right. That's your home. That's correct. And then resources. Yeah. And then your yeah. Looks good. And then if you look at your page, you make sure it still looks okay. Yeah. So it still looks the same. Right? So, yes.
It has created CSS file.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, no, that's fine. It should be new. I'm not saying it says half, but it's just, no, you should have everything in there. So let me see your style SCSS right here. And you have content and so just remove your style CSS, just delete and let it generate.
We'll watch it again.
Yes, so that's the CSS that are generated from the SCSS, that's fine.
And all these hashes are okay.
Right, no, because I think your variable needs to be CSS. Just make this bigger for me. Yeah, that's fine. Yes, CSS, how to map. Yes, it's totally fine. So that's what gets generated by the compiler.
Yeah.
Right, that's good. All right, how did everybody go with that? Good?
What are the hashes for?
It just means it's a CSS file. All right, so again, remember that our index HTML imports what? What does our index HTML include? What is the link to?
CSS.
Style.css. So what's important is that all of our styles end up there, okay? Which they have, all right? But we've accomplished that by separating our code into separate SCSS files and using a Sass compiler to compile them into our one CSS file. And that CSS file is what we would actually post up to our production site and would get loaded by the browser and used by our HTML file, okay? So even though right now, so far, our CSS is still quite simple if you look at it, you know, you could say, well, is it really worth all of that? But what it means is that it's super easy to extend this and enhance it or make changes way easier than if we'd just done it with CSS. And you'll see that when this afternoon when we add responsive elements to it, and we add layout, we haven't added any layout yet, it's going to grow pretty quickly, okay? And so it's going to be much easier to manage it with it all separated out like this, the way that we've got it. And it's definitely what you should see if you go code professionally somewhere. Okay? If you don't, then I'd probably not take that job as a front-end dev. You'd be like, I want to go back in here. Front-end.
And now style CSS is everything in there, is it?
It's in style CSS, yes. All of our styling is actually in style.css now. All right, so there's some resources. Now, I can tell you a little bit, what time is it, about images. Oh, it's 12:20. I'll tell you this afternoon. We'll take a break for lunch. There's other whole worlds here, like images and how we should deal with images and that sort of thing. I pulled an image off of Pexels, that computer keyboard image, and then I resized it in GIMP. Okay, you don't have to resize it. You could use the original image size and control the sizing with CSS, but then you're going to be loading that huge image every time your site loads, which isn't necessarily desirable. So doing some image manipulation is also a good skill for a web developer to have. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a break for lunch. How was that? Wasn't too terrible, was it?